Spectrum rules at the FCC now sit at the center of how quickly competing satellite networks can scale. This is SpaceX Daily, episode 83. SpaceX filed comments urging the FCC to examine the proposed Rocket Lab-Iridium transaction for potential spectrum conflicts. The filing highlights concerns over how the deal could affect frequency allocations used by multiple operators. Regulators will weigh these comments against existing licensing frameworks. The comments reference specific band overlaps that could constrain Starlink operations if left unaddressed. Observers note the move keeps pressure on spectrum policy as more constellations seek approvals. The outcome could influence timelines for new entrants seeking orbital slots. Spectrum policy directly shapes hardware deployment speed, which brings us to another hardware partnership now expanding. Reports detail expanding technical ties between NVIDIA hardware and SpaceX programs. The relationship centers on GPU supply for ground and potential orbital systems. Joint work includes adapting existing accelerator designs for space environments. The collaboration builds on existing ground data center deployments that already support Starlink network operations. No new contract values or delivery schedules appear in the coverage. Further updates would likely surface in supply chain or satellite manifest announcements. The same compute thread appears in long-term architecture thinking. The piece frames NVIDIA hardware integration as part of a broader orbital compute architecture. Starlink backhaul and future satellite nodes are positioned as enablers. The analysis links ground data center experience to proposed in-orbit systems. The blueprint envisions laser-linked satellite clusters performing inference workloads that feed results back through the existing constellation. No specific power budgets or launch manifests are supplied. Readers will track whether future Starship flights carry compute test articles. While compute roadmaps advance, core propulsion decisions still determine flight cadence. Community discussion centers on propellant choice and long-term reusability metrics. Participants note methalox combustion produces fewer contaminants than kerosene-based cycles. The thread explores how cleaner exhaust supports higher flight rates. Commenters also compare turbopump complexity and chamber pressure targets between the two engine families. Thrust-to-weight figures for Raptor 3 remain comparable to late Merlin 1D variants in some regimes. No new test data or production numbers are introduced. Independent modeling confirms positive margins on reused Falcon 9 boosters. The analysis incorporates flight counts, refurbishment intervals, and launch pricing. Results align with earlier public statements on booster life limits. The study examines 9 years of flight history across multiple booster serial numbers. Readers following reuse economics will note the model's sensitivity to turnaround time assumptions. The work does not introduce new flight telemetry. Those same reuse economics scale dramatically when Starship reaches routine refueling. Musk outlined a long-term revenue target for SpaceX that reaches $3.5 trillion. The projection arrives 7 years earlier than some external analyst models. It ties growth assumptions to expanded launch cadence and satellite services. The statement appears in public commentary rather than formal filings. The timeline assumes Starship reaches routine orbital refueling operations within the next decade. Listeners tracking SPCX filings will watch for any restated forward-looking numbers in future disclosures. A detailed post examines platform-based catch options roughly 250 kilometers downrange. Benefits cited include higher payload fractions versus return-to-launch site profiles and faster land tower reuse. The proposal suggests multiple platforms spaced 250 kilometers apart to enable staged recovery during refueling campaigns. Equatorial versus polar mission trade-offs receive explicit attention. The author flags stability, regulatory, and refueling logistics challenges for any offshore structure. No hardware or schedule commitments are referenced. Achieving that cadence may require new recovery infrastructure, which the community is actively debating. The U.S. Air Force clarified that its Starbase Louisiana facility operates independently of SpaceX plans. The statement addresses public confusion over naming and location. Officials emphasized separate missions and infrastructure ownership. The clarification removes one source of local permitting ambiguity. The Air Force site focuses on training and logistics rather than launch operations. No impact on SpaceX's own announced Gulf Coast projects is stated. With that clarification in place, We close with today's market snapshot. Observers on r/SpaceX Lounge continue debating whether downrange catch platforms could shorten land tower refurbishment cycles enough to support daily Starship flights. The discussion notes that Falcon 9 gains 25 to 30% payload when landing on an autonomous drone ship rather than returning to the pad, and assumes a similar 25% gain for Starship. Separate threads examine how Raptor's methalox cycle might reduce ground support contamination compared with Merlin operations, pointing out that Raptor 3 thrust to weight sits near 180 to 1, comparable to the best Merlin 1D figures. One thing worth watching is how multiple Gulf facilities will coordinate airspace and environmental reviews after the Air Force statement that its Starbase Louisiana site has no connection to SpaceX. Local stakeholders have already raised concerns over wetland impacts from any large-scale construction. Resolution would require clear separation of permitting tracks and public disclosure of coordination agreements. The Air Force facility focuses on training ranges while SpaceX targets launch pads, yet both require similar environmental assessments in the same coastal zone. On the AI front, NVIDIA's expanding hardware relationship with SpaceX centers on adapting accelerator systems for both ground training clusters and potential orbital nodes. The Digitimes analysis positions Starlink laser links as the communications backbone for any future on-orbit compute layer, enabling low-latency data movement between satellites and ground stations. The Yahoo Finance segment on the NVIDIA-SpaceX relationship adds context on supply chain integration, but stops short of naming specific GPU generations or power envelopes. The relationship also includes ground-based Colossus-scale clusters that already support XAI model training and could later feed inference workloads routed through Starlink. Observers will watch for any mention of these systems in upcoming Starship payload manifests. From an engineering standpoint, the Reddit discussion on Raptor versus Merlin 1D highlights a core propellant decision that changes ground operations more than peak thrust numbers. Methalox combustion leaves far less carbon residue inside engines and on launch infrastructure than RP1, directly lowering the hours required between flights for inspection and cleaning. That reduction in turnaround labor is the practical lever that makes high flight rates feasible once the vehicle itself is reusable. The same clean exhaust also simplifies environmental permitting for sites that expect dozens of launches per month, because plume composition stays closer to water vapor and carbon dioxide rather than soot and unburned hydrocarbons. First principles accounting shows the cost of each Raptor is still dominated by turbomachinery and chamber fabrication rather than propellant. Yet the propellant choice collapses the hidden cost of post-flight servicing that would otherwise multiply with every additional flight. Listeners tracking booster life limits will therefore watch whether the next series of Raptor flights demonstrates a measurable drop in refurbishment time compared with the final Merlin-era vehicles. The thrust-to-weight ratio of Raptor 3 sits near 180 to 1 in some operating regimes, roughly on par with late Merlin 1D figures, which means the performance edge comes less from raw specific impulse and more from the operational simplicity of a single propellant type across both stages. This uniformity removes the need for separate fuel and oxidizer ground systems at every pad, cutting infrastructure complexity and the chance of cross-contamination during rapid pad turnarounds. The design also supports higher chamber pressures without the coking that limited Merlin reusability, allowing engineers to push the engine harder on each flight while still meeting inspection criteria after recovery. Over time, the cumulative effect appears in the economics of the entire launch system. Fewer ground support personnel per flight, shorter intervals between launches from the same pad, and a lower regulatory burden when environmental impact statements emphasize reduced particulate output. The community thread correctly identifies that these advantages only become decisive once the vehicle achieves rapid reuse. Until then, the propellant choice mainly affects development and test cadence rather than marginal cost per kilogram to orbit. Future static fire and flight data from Raptor 3 vehicles will show whether the predicted reduction in post-flight work materializes at the scale required for Starship's target flight rate. SPCX closed up a fraction of a percent. Before we go, The next series of Raptor flights will show whether the predicted reduction in post-flight work materializes at the scale required for Starship's target flight rate. That's your SpaceX news for today. SPCX is trading at $140.87, up 0.3%. If the show saves you time, a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify genuinely helps new listeners find it. I'm Patrick in Vancouver. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow. One more thing. If you liked today's episode, our sister show Models and Agents is worth a spot in your feed. Your daily briefing on AI models and agents. It's one of the NERA Network's daily briefings, all free at neranetwork.com. And on the website, every episode's visuals live in our free image gallery at neranetwork.com/gallery. Royalty free under Creative Commons, download with attribution. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.